Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the conversations. I'm Sumner Sambo. Now to Europe, where the head of NATO has said differences with Russia over Ukraine will not be easy to resolve. Jens Stoltenberg once again warned Moscow of consequences if it were to invade its neighbor. It follows the first meeting between the NATO-Russia Council in Brussels since 2019. Stoltenberg said allies are concerned about Russia's troop buildup on Ukraine's border and want them to withdraw immediately. Moscow in return wants guarantees that NATO will not accept Ukraine as a member.
I have just chaired a meeting of the NATO-Russia Council at the defining moment for European security. This was not an easy discussion, but that is exactly why this meeting was so important. We had a very serious and direct exchange on the situation in and around Ukraine and the implications for European security. There are significant differences between NATO allies and Russia on these issues. NATO allies are clear-eyed about the prospects for progress in these talks. They expressed serious concern about the Russian military build-up in and around Ukraine and called on Russia to immediately de-escalate the situation and to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of its neighbors. They also called on Russia to refrain from aggressive force posturing and malign activities directed against allies and abide by all its international obligations and commitments. And this means that our dialogue, all this means that our dialogue is difficult, but even more necessary. NATO allies stress that they will make every effort to find a political way forward.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined now on the line from Washington, D.C. by Charles Kupchan, a professor of international affairs at Georgetown University and senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Kupchan served as special assistant to the president and senior director for European affairs on the National Security Council in the Obama White House. Good to have you, Kupchan, join us on the show. And it looks very difficult here for Russia to accept NATO's decisions, and it also seems difficult for NATO to accept some of the demands being put forward by Putin and his associates. Are we heading towards a war?
You know, I think you're right to say that at least for now, the two sides do not have common ground. NATO is saying we keep our doors open. Sovereign nations should be able to choose their own geopolitical alignments and affiliations. Russia is saying you need to tell us through a treaty, through guarantees, that Ukraine will never join NATO. And so the two sides are coming into these talks this week with very different positions. In practice, Ukraine is not on the track to NATO membership for now. NATO is not considering letting Ukraine in. So the question is, can Russia and NATO, Russia and the United States, find some, shall we say, gentleman's agreement that they understand that Ukraine is not going to join NATO, even though NATO keeps its doors open? We'll see in the future whether that kind of understanding can be reached.
And one would want to wonder, why is it important for Ukraine to actually join NATO? What's pushing it? And should the citizens actually be backing the government, considering what looks like a breakdown in talks?
The standoff that we see today goes back to 2014. There was a popular uprising. A president that was pro-Russian was basically overturned. He fled to Russia. And a government came into office that was pro-European, pro-West, pro-American. The Russians responded by annexing the Crimean Peninsula and by fostering a separatist uprising in the eastern part of Ukraine. That has led to a strong anti-Russian attitude among Ukrainian voters. And that's why the Ukrainian government, both the current government and the previous government after 2014, wants to guide the country toward Europe, toward NATO, toward the European Union. In some ways, this is a crisis of Putin's own creation. He aggressed against Ukraine, and that's why now you see this situation where there is a standoff about Ukraine's geopolitical status and its relationship to NATO.
And do you think NATO will hasten the process of admitting Ukraine if tensions continue to rise?
For now, Ukraine's membership in NATO is not under consideration. And that's in part because Ukraine is next door to Russia. It has a border with Russia of some 1,500 miles, land and sea. The idea of defending Ukraine against Russia is something that NATO is not ready to do at this point. President Biden has said, we're not considering sending combat troops to Ukraine. And so I think the question is, can future discussions lead to a situation in which there is a meeting of the minds, in which there is in some ways, a vision of Ukraine as a country that enjoys neutrality, neither part of NATO nor in Russia's sphere of influence. Whether we can guide the country to that endpoint remains uncertain at this stage.
And we've seen Russia actually providing certain demands that may be difficult for NATO to meet. And one of those demands is to go back to the 1997 boundaries before NATO's incursion into what looks like its territory, according to it. Do you think that Putin is being too ambitious in his targets, and considering that NATO would never want to go back to that 1997 boundary?
You're referring to a proposal that the Russians made in recent weeks to essentially make NATO go back to its earlier status. And that means no further expansion to the east, removing NATO troops from countries that have joined since the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's not going to happen. NATO has troops in Poland, in the 3 Baltic countries. NATO's frontier has moved east. It is not going to reverse any of those decisions. It is not going to give Russia a veto on where it puts its troops. So I think the question is, can we look to existing treaties, existing understandings on nuclear weapons, on conventional weapons, on the status of Ukraine to find common ground? We're early in this conversation. It's too soon to say.
And the rhetoric coming up from Moscow hasn't been very helpful. For example, the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, was warning that Russia expects a quick answer to some of its demands. Doesn't that sound like a war rhetoric?
Well, we're in a delicate situation now because Russia has 100,000 troops, perhaps more, on the border with Ukraine. It's in some ways putting a gun to Ukraine's head to force this conversation. We don't know what President Putin has in his mind. We don't know whether he actually has the stomach to invade Ukraine and perhaps occupy a major part of the country. I don't think the Kremlin has made a decision. That's why the conversations taking place today and this week are so important. And I think that right now we're seeing whether the United States, its NATO allies, the Europeans can find some middle ground which keeps the Russians happy, that is to say, not ready to invade Ukraine, but keeps NATO's doors open and guides Ukraine to become a successful democracy, an open economy, a country free of Soviet penetration and coercion, Russian coercion and penetration. This is where we are today.
And the rest of the world watches while these meetings are ongoing. I mean, it's going to be a very tough week for officials, US officials, NATO officials, and all of that. But one would want to wonder what the role of the United Nations should be on this issue, considering that the Russian troops are just hanging around Ukraine.
Well, right now, this is the conversation that's taking place in a transatlantic context. US, Russia, NATO, Russia, another organization called the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, of which Ukraine is a member. They will also be addressing this issue this week. I think one question that we need to put on the table is, could the UN stand up some kind of peacekeeping mission? Could the United Nations send troops to the border between the occupied areas of Ukraine and the rest of Ukraine to enforce a ceasefire and enable diplomacy to proceed? That's something that is under discussion. We'll see whether it comes to fruition.
And the sort of language coming up from Europe itself has been sort of lukewarm. We are seeing France calling for caution, the new German government being lukewarm about this issue itself. And it doesn't seem like they are pushy just the way Russia is about going to war, if indeed talks break down and Russia invades Ukraine. How do you think these strong allies of the US should reinforce these discussions and ensure that it's either they're backing the US or they find a common ground so as to reduce the tension?
I think one of the strongest suits of the United States and NATO when it comes to Russia is solidarity, unity. Going back to 2014, when Russia first invaded Ukraine, the United States worked very closely with its European partners to impose sanctions, economic sanctions against Russia as a way of pushing back against the Kremlin's actions. Right now, I think the strongest suit remains transatlantic solidarity. And that's why the United States has been working closely with its partners in Europe and with the European Union to put in the window, to signal a set of very significant economic sanctions that would be imposed on Russia if it further invades Ukraine. And so right now we've got the sticks, further economic sanctions, the carrots, the conversation with Russia, the diplomatic effort on Ukraine. We'll see now whether this combination of carrots and sticks can avoid a major war in Europe, which would be in some ways a terrible event that would redivide Europe, in some ways going back to the Cold War.
And just very quickly, in less than 30 seconds, how does this Ukraine situation differ from that of Georgia when Russia invaded that country?
Well, you're right to mention Georgia. NATO in 2008 issued a statement at a summit that Georgia and Ukraine would one day become NATO members. Georgia, the government there, engaged in some provocative actions, and it led to Russian incursions into two areas of Georgia, one called Abkhazia, the other called South Ossetia. And as a consequence, there are these two chunks of Georgia that are effectively occupied. Ukraine matters much more. It's a country that's much larger. It's got 44 million people. It borders on a major body of water that of strategic significance. And so in some respects, the issues, Ukraine, Georgia, are similar, but Ukraine carries more weight because of its size and because of the symbolism of its long-term relationship with Russia.
Very interesting indeed. We must thank you, Charles Kupchan, Senior Fellow of the Council of Foreign Relations, joining us to take a critical look at what's going on in the talks between Russia and NATO, and including the US during this week.